program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Inside Mojo podcast, where each week we're looking back at 20 years of WatchMojo's history on YouTube. I'm your host, Rob, and with me, as always, is WatchMojo's CEO and co-founder, Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. How are you doing today, Ash? You are back from a trip?
Yeah, no, I'm a bit tired, but super excited and whatnot. So I was at the Web Summit in Rio, in lovely Rio in Brazil. And then I hopped over to Buenos Aires, which I'd always wanted to visit. Incredible cities, you know, very different, obviously. But no, I mean, especially Buenos Aires. I mean, Rio, obviously, the beach and all that was great. And the presentation went really well, and people really liked it. A lot of people, you know, seemed to appreciate it. And then Buenos Aires was easily top 5 cities I visited.
What kind of people were down there for Web Summit? Was it a lot of companies similar to WatchMojo, or was it a mixed bag? Like who was down there?
To be honest, there are definitely media companies, and more were like content creators as well. It was a bit funny to walk around and see everybody. Even it was funny, like you'd see investors because they would have the investor badge and they would be filming themselves like influencers. But no, it's basically, you know, to Web Summit's credit, they started years ago, I guess, in Dublin, and then they moved it to Lisbon, you know, and they were there for a long time. And that's the first time I went to speak at one of their events, and then also did Toronto. And this one was really just because I always wanted an excuse to, you know, go to South America. And no, it was great, but it's massive. There's like 40,000 people, and a lot of investors go to see emerging startups. So it's kind of the theme that we're covering today. And then, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of, I mean, I wish I would have stayed a bit longer, but, you know, have a business to run. And when you travel alone, it's hard, you know, because you got to stay out of trouble. And I don't mean that in any specific way, but it's like literally danger, you know, taking a wrong turn. Even my wife was joking. She's like, yeah, just don't come back with like a Sofia Vergara, who's Colombian. I was like, no.
I don't think you'd come back. I think you'd stay there with Sofia Vergara.
No. And it's like, you know, everybody's so warm and passionate, and you're like, oh, this is such a great place. If you're single and, you know,
and ready to mingle.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad place to be, type of thing. But no, back, you know, used to do a lot of traveling, a lot more in red eyes and stuff, so it was fine, you know.
Cool. Sounds like a fun trip. Yeah. Well, good segue to this week's episode because we're talking about fundraising. So let's kick it off. What did you envision for this episode? What do you want to share about fundraising from your perspective?
Again, just in the spirit of not just like boring people with like my experience, just to make it useful for possible entrepreneurs and storytellers, creators. You know, 2025, the world is a very different place. If you are a creator, a storyteller, an entrepreneur, a founder, you have a plethora of options. There's a lot of people who are friends and family of yours who have heard of startups, who may have money. They may kind of be, you know, not interested to invest in real estate or the stock market, which is volatile. You could also go to the bank and get a loan, obviously. There are a lot of angel investors who write smallish checks, but, you know, could be there and open up their network. You have venture capitalists whose sole raison d'etre is to take like crazy high risk bets that could be grand slam, you know, returns. And depending on the size of your project, there's, you know, private equity, family offices. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There's even like corporate venture where some companies like Disney and Warner have their own funds. And so, yeah, but you have to be realistic as an entrepreneur of understanding what it means to take outside capital.
Okay, so what does it mean? Like, what are some of the pros and cons from your perspective?
I mean, we could list the obvious pros and cons, but let me give you an analogy, since I love analogies. And this applies to many professions, including just banks. But investors are people, ultimately, who will give you an umbrella when it's sunny, but when it gets rainy and times get tough, are almost like, I want that umbrella back, right? That is just a reality. investors, and I'm an investor, so if I say something even remotely, I'm not saying you're as an entrepreneur to be like slandering anybody. I just want entrepreneurs to understand what it means. When you take money from anybody, you have a fiduciary duty to not just return it to them, but to return it to them, if in the case of debt, with interest on a regular basis. And in the case of investment, a multiple back, meaning a venture capitalist, if he lends you $1, isn't interested to get back $1.20, not even interested to get $2 or $3. They're looking for $10 back, or sometimes $100 back. And that's because of what we discussed already, power law. Power law is basically, in a portfolio, you're going to have one outsized return grand slam kind of outcome. Most of your bets are going to fizzle and die. So you really need things to get bigger. So already, as an entrepreneur, it's not that you are special or not. It's not that your project is great or not. The VC is really looking at, is this going to be that 100 times return company? And most are not, right? And I mean, realistically, even WatchMojo wasn't. WatchMojo will go down as like one of the, knock on wood, best like media investments ever. But I concede it will never be a Google or Uber type of return. So even if like a VC is there, they're gonna be like, okay, VC would actually be like, yeah, hats off. Okay, that was good. But it's not necessarily, when you go in and take the time to chase money, you really have to like read the room and understand, like, if this isn't like a kind of like possible next unicorn, like a Google, a Uber, or whatever, you may be wasting your time. And then the other thing, in terms of what it means to you, you're basically signing a deal where you're being given money, but it's the rope with which you will hang yourself eventually, right? Because if you raise too much money, that means you got to really scale and really make it big. If you raise too little money and you don't hit your numbers, and everybody is expecting things to go upwards and to the right, hockey growth, curve stick, whatever. And that's usually what is a reality I've learned. Costs are always going to be higher and come up faster. It's like when you're driving, it's like you're going really fast. The costs are in your face.
Yeah.
But the return and the revenue, you're like, we're almost there. It's never there. And it takes longer. Now, yes, if you have a good business, once you find that tipping point, might be rocket ship, but it's usually not. So when you are an investor, when you're an entrepreneur, you really, really have to kind of ask yourself, we've already said, like, do you have the time, the patience and all that? But it may not be at all what like a venture capitalist wants. It may be what an angel would consider. It might be what your friends and family would love to back, but then they don't have the money. But because you're ultimately starting this countdown clock that you have to build quickly enough to justify the deal, it might also be like you signed your death certificate, and that is a reality. Oftentimes even an investor could say, hey, we don't mind giving you money for it, but you're now like chief something or just some other role, and we're going to bring in an adult who's kind of got the experience. And that's just like a trade-off. And I think that is something that most entrepreneurs just are not realistic about.
All right, we got a poll that I'd like to ask the audience. So this is up on WatchMojo's YouTube channel. We'd like to know, who would you rather borrow money from? Family or friends, a bank, an investor, or if there's another option, please let us know in the comments, and we'll revisit that towards the end of the episode. So you've mentioned...
Well, not to be anal, but borrow implies only a loan. We're talking in general, like borrow money, raise money, like where would the source of the capital? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll revisit that towards the end of the episode. So you mentioned a few different sources of potential revenue, angels, venture capitalists, etc. I imagine these come in all different shapes and sizes. Is it very different looking for, let's say, $100,000 investment versus a $10 million investment?
Yeah.
And how do you navigate? How do you navigate depending on what your needs are? And as you said, there's also risk in not getting enough money versus too much. So like, how do you find that balance?
That's a great question. So realistically, an analogy is, if you're going to have like a party, you have to be like, how many pizzas do I need to order? It's not obvious, and you don't want to have too little food. You also don't want to be eating pizzas the rest of like the whole week. Well, nothing wrong with that.
Some may be fine with that.
Yeah, no, I am fine with that. I could eat pizza all the time. But the point is, it's probably hard for most entrepreneurs who are going to be listening to a show like this on this, theme, that may not have the experience to be like, oh, we need $1 million, right? So I knew that, like, well, the $250,000 I started with wasn't going to cut it, and so we were always like, we got to figure out what you need. So then you got to work backwards. You don't want to be in a situation where you're constantly going to go back to the markets and raise. Not just that it's a big old distraction and waste of time, but it's because every time you go raise money, your investors are going to look at what did you promise them last time and what did you do? And if that does not jive, they're like, you're not a credible person.
Right.
You're wasting my time. So the first thing you want to do is, without overdoing it, you do want to be conservative to understand what is the runway you need to be profitable, right? Basically, runway just meaning the time it takes or whatever. So let's say these are not officially, I don't even remember. But if we, for example, had $500,000 of total costs, well, I was like, 250 is going to get me 6 months of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to take 6 months to meet investors and, have the song and dance and then legal and accounting due diligence and all that. So you basically start to fundraise right away, right? But so that for that reason, I was like, okay, we would probably be smart to raise $1 million or $2 million, because the value of the company is pretty low now. So the more we raise, the more you got to give up to the investor. And it's, I talk about greed and, fear and all that. So that risk and return trade-off is, you might go, some crazy investor could give you 5 million when it's just an idea. But if you value your business at 5 million, you gave them 100%, right? So that's then when the other part of that equation comes, which is once you figure out your budget, your runway, your needs, the time, and then juxtapose it to the time it takes to close, you do have to come up with some kind of trade-off where, again, your greed and fear has to balance on a scale with the investor's greed and fear. Now, the investor's greed and fear, they don't call it that. It's two things. One is like their risk profile, and you get a sense like a VC would be willing to take a total loss. If you borrow money from your uncle or he invests in your business, you probably don't want to lose his money, and he also doesn't want to lose his money. You understand? So that's another thing. But then ultimately, this is why sometimes you do hear, especially now with this amplified during the zero interest rate phenomenon that we've covered in previous shows, if all of a sudden you realize that you need, let's say, $50 million, you might end up just agreeing with the investor that you're worth 100 million on paper, so that the 50 plus the 100 yields 150, and then they get 50 on the post money of 150, so they get 33%. You understand why? Because you were okay as an entrepreneur. You weren't that greedy. You were fine to give up, let's say, 33%. And the VC also wants you to keep skin in the game. They don't want to be too greedy, because they also have to balance that. If they were to come and say, no, you're only worth 50 million, let's say, again, it's arbitrary. You don't even have a business yet, but because you need 50 million in data centers and Quaaludes, whatever,
all that important stuff,
all that of the intangibles. Hey, if you're going to be in sales, Lord knows what you got to do. But so it is just a song and dance. And as much as like people could say, oh, it's finance and it's just math. No, there's a lot of psychology that goes into it. And again, I got turned down by over 100. I did have a handful that did want to invest, but it wasn't the numbers that we were necessarily not on. It was more the strategy, the principle. I would sit across the room and I go, this is a bit like marriage. It's very easy to say yes because, hey, there's Sofia Vergara, you agree, fine, but you got to wake up the next day. And then actually that's when the relationship takes off. So those are all things to consider.
I find that the perception is that more of the risk falls on the investor side of the coin. But you did bring up a good point that there are trade-offs to taking on outside investors. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And in the situation of WatchMojo, where we did get investment,
Yeah. So,
like, how did it impact the company?
Yeah. So that is, first of all, your first question, an incredible question, because you're right. Again, if we're talking about your uncle, George, that's risk for him, for sure. He doesn't want to lose that money. You don't want to lose that money. It's going to be really awkward.
That's a personal relationship too, so it adds an
Exactly.
extra wrinkle.
No, exactly. And then that bridge is burned, and then your mom calls. You're like, "What did you do to my brother's money?" Right. So that's totally. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about VCs. VCs are professionals. VCs will use, and again, I'm an investor as well, so I'm not knocking them. VCs are very good at these mind games, right? It's like investment bankers, like lawyers. When I talk to these people, I'm like mind blown. I'm like, your methods of manipulation and mind control are like, I don't even think in these evil ways, so to speak. But it's because they'll be very good at saying like, oh, we have LPs, limited partners, meaning just the investors that gave them the money, so then they could go out and give you the money. So they'll be very good at being like, well, we have limited partners and we have a fiduciary duty, ergo we got to do this, They will also totally cram down bad terms down your throat. There's such a thing called a cram down round, where they're cramming down the terms. And the mistakes that the entrepreneurs make is we collectively get too obsessed with valuation, even though it's a paper valuation. Nobody's coming and giving you that money per se. Yep. They're just saying we're valuing, like, my $1 million Lily, my beloved dog, and your two $500,000 cats. You understand? Like, to set a relative value. But the mistake entrepreneurs make is they don't think about liquidation preferences, meaning how and who gets the money first when there is eventually money to be made, type of thing.
Yeah.
Or drag along, piggyback, vesting. There's a lot of stories where entrepreneurs end up selling their business for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And people are surprised as to, well, why do they only have like 1% or 0.5%, which makes no sense. So the main thing is you should not obsess about valuation. You should really think of terms. There's VCs say this, your valuation, my terms, for a reason.
Yeah.
And the most important consideration are the liquidation preferences, which we'll talk about. But the other thing is, absolutely, a VC is a professional. Even if a VC will do many, many questionable things to not lose money because they have a fiduciary duty, they understand, and their accredited investors understand, that most of these investments may be a total loss. So it's not risky to them in that sense, because they almost wear it like with honor. Like, oh, we wrote a big check and it didn't work out. And they will blame everybody else but themselves, even if they were a disaster at the board level. But for these reasons, for sure, it's the entrepreneur that is taking the risk. The time, like for 6 years, I don't need to repeat it, didn't pay myself, mortgage my place. And then once we broke even, I was like, okay, now, I feel like I can breathe a little bit. But okay, now comes copyright. Now comes platform. It's kind of like dance, Jim. There's always a bullet.
Yeah.
They're kind of like trying to avoid a bunch of bullets. So to me, yeah, the risk is like almost, if you had a pie, 100%, who takes the risk? Okay, maybe 10% is the investor, because they are ultimately writing a check. But it's their job, and it comes with the territory that they may lose it. The entrepreneur is the one that's really, really taking the risk. But this is also what, as an entrepreneur, you have to, be ready to sign up for. And unfortunately, most are not. Like, I think the era of ZERP, the era of everything we've discussed in previous episodes, has kind of created this kind of false idea of what an entrepreneur is and what it takes and how long. And then there, this gentleman that I know, so like I invested in, let's say, 15 startups. And of the 15, really, one only should be a big hit. 1 or 2 may be so-sos, and 10 should lose. I'm seeing about 5 that are like doing really well. I don't know if they're going to be unicorns, but there are 5 that are clearly doing very well. There are 5 who are lost at sea, still trying to figure it out. There's 5 who are either dead or should be dead, not setting aside the emotion. One of them, the entrepreneur, was like, well, when I stopped the business, I had to file for bankruptcy, because otherwise I did have personal, like I basically was also like putting up my house as collateral, right? So I totally empathize where he's coming from. So he basically had to file for bankruptcy. That takes a toll on you. You understand? So it's like it's like not like for the VCs in that deal. One of them literally was like, I mean, this is Chatham rules. Like, well, I'm not going to mention who, but it's educational. The VC, that's all we are together. We're this. We help build. Like, take the credit when like they shouldn't. At the end was like, yeah, I'd rather if we just put a bullet in this because I don't want to have the paperwork if it's not going to be a big thing. And I was like, no, let me see if I could find them other investors or, pull off a Hail Mary. That's what turned me off a lot, because I was like, I know what it takes to be in the trenches. Like, I remember my favorite when I used to play soccer, I didn't want to win when we won like 5-1 or something. I liked those rare times when we were down and we came back. That was the whole fun. And I saw that when push comes to shove, my God, you're all full of it, basically.
Yeah. Well, they're giving a little piece of their pie, and the entrepreneur, that's their entire life that's on the line here. So
it's like you hear about the eggs, they're like, an entrepreneur, there's one egg. If they break it, that's it. Yeah. Whereas like, a VC will put, many, and I mean, we don't need to get into family offices and, well, let's talk about your second question. I couldn't give away equity in the early years. I've said this because most people didn't want to invest in content. But those who did, we didn't see eye to eye, not because of money. I didn't care about valuation. I didn't care about any of that. But because I was like, for example, the way now people are obsessed with AI content. And I'm like, AI is a tool. It could do stuff, but don't be stupid. It's not just going to, back then people wanted just like content farms or just, the lowest cost possible scaling. And I was like, you morons, you're still telling stories. There needs to be a heart and soul in this. It's now we talk about authenticity, but that passion, la pasión. I was like, you need this stuff. So in the end, I was like, okay, I'm going to get money and I'm going to think it's, forget what the terms are going to be in the end. But I was like, the day after the ink dries, they're going to come and they're going to want to cut costs, or they're going to want to invest with totally unrealistic return expectations. Or they're also going to want us to just go down this downward spiral, which I did not believe in. Not because I was like maniacal. I mean, I'm not Lenin here. I'm not Karl Marx. But I was just like, look, that's not the way the media works. Now, even though at the time I was like writing for TechCrunch, writing for Media Post, I was seen. I mean, I myself was somewhat insecure. The industry saw me as somebody that had a clue of what to do. So I was like, I'd rather not take this money because it's not like a deal with the devil, but it is like it's going to have a boomerang ricochet effect where I'm going to wake up with a severe hangover. So we didn't do it. But what happened is, as I alluded to, when COVID hit, it did change the options for investors. Investors really only, again, forget Uncle George, forget others. Investors, when they raise capital, they generally make money. Obviously, they have a salary, but that salary is basically management fees of the fund, which are usually, you could say, 2%. But they only really earn that 2% when they actually write a check to invest. Otherwise, imagine you go raise $1 billion and you go live in Rio and you're like, this is great, I'm meeting entrepreneurs. So obviously, there's some checks and balances. And then they have carry, which is 20% of the profits. That's if there are any exits. So investors, by 2020, we were too big for VCs, which usually invest earlier, and smaller. I mean, some VCs will write huge checks. And so we did not need money for traditional sense like of, we need a bridge till we get profitable, or we need to go buy something. We want to buy the biggest fax machine in the world. I know what I mean? Like, you need a use of proceeds. Yeah. What I really wanted, though, was, even though I was like I'm a bit creative and crazy, but I'm also very like conservative and strong administrator and all that, studying finance. So I was like, okay, we run a tight ship, but ultimately I have like 100 I was in Argentina. I was meeting some of our team there. And I told them, I'm not here with an agenda. I'm here just to meet you guys. And you guys now will see that I'm available to you. If you have any ideas to improve, anything, just my door's open. I'm here to help you. Yeah. And so I was like, if like lightning hits and bye-bye Ashkan, like just I'm gone. I was like, it's going to affect a lot of people. I was like, there's okay, payment goes through, your payroll goes through. I'm totally replaceable. I built a business. And that's also a thing about entrepreneurship. If you build a business that you cannot kind of take yourself out, you're not an entrepreneur. You're just a slave type of thing. Not disrespectfully a slave, but you know what I mean? But so I was like, okay, I add something to the business. Obviously I have a lot of knowledge in this field, but the problem was I felt it wasn't like, it was not operationally, administratively, it was a bit too much of a one-man show. So how do you get somebody to care if you're a single parent about your child? Well, you need a co-parent, which you want. Yes, you want somebody you love and you share your love and affection, but you want somebody to ultimately come and adopt almost your child, right?
Right.
That you share that obviously experience and joy, but you're like, okay, it's even subconsciously that's good. You need that. So I felt that with COVID, when like half the world got decimated, like Thanos snapped his finger and travel got hit and all these industries got killed, I was like, well, what's stopping Donald Trump from shutting down YouTube? What's stopping copyright? We're legit. There's no real risk, knock on wood, but you never know. Platform risk, whatever. But also key man risk. You know, I understand we built a team. I'm nothing without, like, if everybody else, I can come up with ideas, but I don't know how to edit. You know, there's certain things you realize, but administratively, it was too much risk around one person. So I was like, if I go get an investor and they come and they share the risk, yes, financially it was good, but I didn't need, the WatchMojo by then was very successful. And because nobody wanted to share the risk with me on reasonable terms, yes, in finance parlance, I took the risk. Let's say, like the executive team, we all kind of benefited, but it was mainly for me just security, insurance, which I know sounds a bit weird, but as an entrepreneur, you're paranoid. Like Andy Grove, co-founder of Intel, popularized that line. Only the paranoid survive. So yeah, like the 2010s, I basically every day I had one worry or another. I was like, something is gonna F us today. What is that? Slot machine. But so when I brought them on, I didn't actually do a process. Like I didn't necessarily go out and hire although we did hire an investment bank because you want expertise. I didn't necessarily go mandate a bank and say, go call everybody. I was like, Paramount ain't investing in anything now. Disney is trying to figure out theme parks with masks. So it was like, I was like, just make sure, given my style of being too polite, yes, there's crazy Ash, but my default mode is very polite, very courteous. And I was like, that's not the right way to negotiate with investors because they're going to come and be like, we need all these terms because we have a duty to. And I was like, I'm going to need somebody to push back a bit. You have your lawyers, but the bankers, again, powers of manipulation and, persuasion that somebody could speak on your behalf, So we just spent 6 months virtually during COVID. They were American, and that was also cool. They ultimately invested in us, never meeting me in person. So they called people, and that's what I get more of a high on that than like how many subscribers we have. Mm-hmm. The idea was, and again, I just want to preface it. Now it's going to be a bit more specific, but it's still meant to be general. So we lucked out in terms of like character, integrity, alignment of values in terms of like ethics and whatnot. It's a New York-based firm called Star Mountain Capital, formerly known as Halyard. So there's a couple gentlemen, and they had worked actually for like there's like small things that I pay attention to that probably they may even not care about. But like I remember like they had worked for as investment bankers for like some Canadian banks. So I was like, okay, like although they were based in the US, I was like, okay, they know that culture a little bit. They know how we are as Canadians. The founder of Halyard merged with Star Mountain. Star Mountain, its founder was a Canadian, who was an athlete and, really seemed like a good guy, smart guy, also very entrepreneurial. So that I liked. Nothing against some guy who leads a fund like that, but who's more of like corporate. There's nothing wrong with that. You want that. There's strengths to that. But I did like that. So there's a lot of like nuances and whatnot that I like. I also like that it wasn't like bad faith negotiations. If there was something that was important for me, if I explained it, they would come back with like a creative solution to implement it on a piece of paper. One thing in particular, I remember going like, yeah, they're probably going to push back. They don't know me. They don't know why this matters to me. But I was like, no, these are reasonable people. And in turn, I think when they want stuff, I wouldn't even push back. I would be like, sometimes just I'm like, teach me, I'm a sponge. Why is this important? And I was like, okay, because I was like, I may have to explain it, or in 2 years, if it comes back to bite me, I don't want to. So fantastic on that front. But again, just being very transparent, the media world changed, right? I mean, what happened was interest rates shot up. We had our first down year, and in that they were very professional and they weren't like yelling or anything like that. But also because I'm not a dishonest person. I think it's like I'm also a lot of it was external, right?
Yeah.
But as we started to work together, so another reason I wanted to do a deal was because I wanted, before ever selling, finally to like a Paramount or whomever, Paramount, like MTV, because like MTV was one of the many companies over the years. I was like, very impressive, I wanted to avoid a scenario where I just sold to like a Bell Media in Canada or a Viacom in the US or like a Bertelsmann in Germany, wherever. And then we just become like, and I have no problem with this, like we kind of bring down the WatchMojo flag a bit. We put up their flag. It's equals, but ultimately you're fighting under another flag.
Yeah, you're under that umbrella now.
And I don't mind. Personally, no ego with that. In fact, that's like the made man. That's like when many get in this racket for that. But I was like, if we never try to go really big, which usually you do need funding because you want to be able to take bigger risks, aim for the fence. I was like, yeah, at the age I'm at, like early 40s, I was like, I will probably regret that. People say they don't regret things. It's a lie. You regret it. Now you move on, you manage. But so I was like, I wouldn't mind doing that before, with the passage of time, while I'm happy on 89% of, 97% of the reasons. Yeah, it's true that money alone is never the solution. And I used to say this. I'm like, when you actually have money, you throw money at problems thinking that's a quick solve, and it's not. You just end up burning the money, and you're like, it needed time. It needed TLC. So as we, do I want to go to, okay, I'll mention this. So what I done in the, why not?
I'm curious.
You
can't stop now.
So if you would have told me like in October or November, if you were like, hey, do you think that like WatchMojo will do another transaction and be acquired? Yeah, I would have been like, not really, because you have the uncertainty of possibly a change in administration in the US. There's talk of tariffs. There's booms and crashes and ups and downs. I was like, all the likely media companies are trying to fix their business. Disney overindulged by going to Disney Plus and Output. Warner is merged with Discovery. Like WatchMojo's inform and entertain ethos actually resonates with like Warner Entertain and Discovery Learn, for example.
Yeah.
But I was like, they're in cost-cutting mode. Their house is a mess. Like they're not going to go build an extension right now, right? So when I kind of looked at the landscape, I was like, yeah, no, forget about it. But what ended up happening is a lot of companies realized what we saw 20 years ago, that YouTube is the future. In fact, it's the present and the future.
Yeah.
And most of them had underinvested, no real exposure, but most of their options to become present and significant on YouTube were non-existent. You could not necessarily, go and buy a PewDiePie channel, and you cannot go buy WWE's channel or Taylor Swift's channel, right? So because WatchMojo was one of the few investable or acquirable assets as a company and a brand, we started to see like, okay, even if there's going to be all this uncertainty in the market, at least in our little universe, there does seem to be. So we are now kind of like on the fence of saying, hey, there's all this interest again, because not just that, okay, WatchMojo is a bona fide, again, being at Web Summit, people were, telling me how much they love the brand and know the brand and all that. But you always have to put things in the macro. So yeah, to my own surprise, it's possible that in order to give that return to the investor, which you don't control, it's the market, it's timing, we may do something like that and join a bigger company, but we shall see.
Interesting. We got a really great question from the audience.
Sure.
Somebody would like to know, what advantages did bootstrapped founders have that VC-backed founders often overlook?
I'm not saying this to be rude to any VC-backed entrepreneur, because let's face it, some of the greatest ones are VC-backed, but you are really not in control anymore. Like you don't, even if you sell 5%, doesn't matter. You might have sold 90%, may as well have, because it's the terms. So you have like a lot of veto rights that you have to agree to. You sometimes will not be able to sell just because you feel like it. Now, yeah, there's a conversation. And if you as the lead entrepreneur, lead person, I was like, I'm selling, the investors may have to accept it. But there's many stories where the VCs will veto a deal. And you realize, hey, man, even if they only have 12.2% on the cap or capitalization table, they're controlling it because they have certain veto rights, right? So I think that is really the biggest one, that you effectively lose control. Now, it's a bit crude to be like, I mean, even when I was younger, and even though I used this last month, I think then you're a venturepreneur because you really are not like old OG style gunslinger. And then the other one, and then we can move to the poll, which was more important for me, was all about principles. Like, I'm not saying investors are unethical. There's some of the most legit, stellar, high quality individuals could be very much investors. But I do think that an investor will always prioritize profit because they have a fiduciary duty to their LP. The real OG entrepreneur will focus on principles and their purpose, which was my closing at the Rio, which we'll talk about. When I left, it was about the industry. But you know me, I like entrepreneurship. I like the intangibles of this racket. So I kind of was like, look, what I said was, I mean, maybe we could play it, but the gist was, if you focus on your principles and find your purpose, you will eventually, if you're good and lucky and all that, you will earn the profit you are chasing. But basically, I was implying there's way too many entrepreneurs that become entrepreneurs because of profit, just money. No real purpose, no principles, or not consistent. I go, then yeah, you're not going to be successful because somebody else will beat you at what you're trying to do.
Yeah. A bit of a cliche at this point, but that's because it's true, right?
Yeah, no, it's a super cliche, but the reason why I could say it so openly is because I want entrepreneurs to know, like, okay, why do we do this? We do this hoping that it helps creators, storytellers, entrepreneurs. But this is not the sexy narrative. Remember, like, I don't even know, like, in 2006 when we started, there was a startup that was like, you probably know Dig. Like there was Reddit and Dig. Dig was the one that got more. So Dig did a investment round that valued the business at 60 million. And Business Week put a picture of Kevin Rose, its founder, be like, this kid, typical that era, like you look flannel shirt.
Yeah, I think we had that categorized under the bullshit section of last week's episode.
Yeah. Not Kevin Rose. Kevin Rose was like a pretty smart guy, but it was more the media.
Yeah.
The media was like, oh, how this whiz kid build a $60 million business. It was not really a $60 million business. And incidentally, Reddit only sold for 10 million. That came out of Y Combinator, only sold quotation mark for 10 million. And its founder,
there he is.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I actually invested in the Reddit founders fund, but he's written about this. I'm not saying anything. He regrets selling in a way at the time he did to Condé Nast because Reddit is now publicly traded and worth a shit ton of money.
Yeah.
And as an entrepreneur, like that's the weird thing, like. Sometimes you live with the regret of a failure when something doesn't turn out, but some entrepreneurs have more regret when they almost sell and leave money on the table. That's why it's like there's a lot more that goes into it.
The legacy plays into it a lot.
Legacy is a huge thing. Yeah, legacy is definitely.
You mentioned the poll results. We have those. They're in. We asked, who would you rather borrow or raise money from? And 40% said family or friends. That's the number one answer. Bank, 31%. Investors 21% and other 6%. I don't know what those others are, but
the mob,
the mob, yeah.
That's why I was really in South America. I'm kidding. That's a bad stereotype. Yeah, I mean that's really, really interesting because family and friends, there's, in my humble opinion, way too much baggage. Bank, that means loan. So okay, you keep control so long as you pay the bills. Investor, okay, I thought that would be higher. And yeah, I'm really curious by the 6%, but that's fine.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yvonne, our producer, says less questions are asked by family and friends. I guess that's true.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, also the other is if you're like a creator, you have like things like Kickstarter. You have crowdsourcing. You also have like companies like Spotter, like SPOTTR. They come and they give you an advance on like royalties of your back catalog. But that means you have to be established, right? So if you're like a Mr. Beast and you're Mr. Beast is the extreme, but these are not our numbers. Let's say if a Joe, the creator, or even WatchMojo, let's say you make $1 million a year, on average every year, like your back catalog, they could come and be like, okay, we'll give you whatever, like half of that, one lump sum, and then we'll recoup a sum that will be far greater than what they're giving you, but you get that money today to go do a documentary, or in our case, we actually did a Kickstarter for
a game.
Terrible Influence. Yeah. So that's, and we hit like 136% of the target we wanted. And reality was we were always keeping that like an ace in the back of our pocket. We thought of like, we've done 2 documentaries, Fox in the Hen House, how geek culture overtook pop culture. Those we didn't really need Kickstarter. And then as much as I would like to consider something like that for like a scripted project or like a real BHAG kind of thing, it has to be like related but different enough to what we do. You know, understand? Yeah. And then there's the optics that us as a creator, there you go. Us as a company, I never wanted it to seem like a handout. I know the folks at Vox, when the ZERP era ended, I don't blame them, but a lot of their viewers raised their eyebrows when Vox, this, big company that had all this venture backing, was like, hey, do you want to fund our programming? And even I was like, okay, it's bold. And, like I would have liked to be in the room to like the positioning, the messaging, because intentions are never, what are not perceived the way you intended them.
What about for small creators? Because we live on YouTube as WatchMojo, but a lot of individuals have their channels and their brands. And as we mentioned, crowdfunding is something that's available to them. But is looking for venture capital a wise option for somebody like that who has a smaller business?
That's a good question, and so much about timing, because like 20 years ago I would have laughed. And that's one reason why WatchMojo was packaged as a company, both because I wanted each topic to be the star. I didn't necessarily want it to be Ashmojo, and there was many reasons. Today you actually have like Sam Lessin, who I think it's him. Sam Lessin was an early Facebook employee. And so he launched Slow Ventures, for example. And Slow Ventures actually is geared towards the creator economy. So yes, you know what? If you fit certain things, again, I'm sure he cares about the vertical you're in. Is it brand safe? Are you a credible person, or do you have a checkered past? I'm sure it's still, there's certain criterias that are taken from like traditional venture investing, but it is geared towards justement what you're describing, the creator economy. I don't know if ultimately creators are, and I'm an investor, so I'm saying this like if somebody came to me, I don't know if the creators are really an investable like category. It is, and people used to say WatchMojo is a lifestyle business as a knock, and I was like, maybe it's a boutique business, but I don't think it's but I think creators are the ultimate lifestyle business, and for 2 reasons. Successful ones can earn great income, and they could have great lives. But yeah, it is like a burnout risk, the shelf life. Eventually, there was a gal, many actually, who were like, yeah, I started doing like vlogs when I was like 18, unemployed in Hollywood. I was lost in life. I don't want to be doing that same shtick.
Yeah. Well, you hear it time and time again with the whole burnout phenomenon. But
also the shelf life of what you cover. If you were like, oh, silly reactions about stuff, okay, after doing 300 of those videos, you may be tired. So yeah, I think you do have as a creator more options, but I really think you have to do it in a way where you have to commit to it enough. But you definitely want to, before going out there and committing 5 years of your life to now be a slave for like some venture capitalist who's like, doesn't really care, doesn't have any passion for the topics you cover. And before long is going to disagree with, what to do. I don't necessarily think that is the way to go. I think you're still better off like starting it off as a side hustle, tickering, iterating, adding cadence, frequency, velocity. And then there will come a point where then, yeah, you could maybe get a little bank loan or even just secure a credit line. You could find a brand deal. You could maybe find not just advertisers. There are companies out there that may say, you know what, you're pretty good at what you do. Why don't we do a deal where we get like exclusive distribution, or we just license some of this. Like, that's, I think, the way that creators should really think. Like, and that's might not lead to $1 billion outcome, but there are no unicorns really in media the way that they are in tech anyway. So
Yeah.
the jury's out. And I don't want to just be like, oh yeah, there are these funds, go do it, because investors are fickle, right? Investors, if they don't see the return, they will move on. And that's bad. If you have an investor on your cap table that is no longer committed, not just to the company, but to the category, you see it. They're just, gone, here today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing to consider. So now that WatchMojo has a board of investors, have you seen that affect the content in any way, or is that a non-issue?
Okay, to be fair, we had to make some changes like early on with brand safety, because like you guys were, I love you all, but even though I sometimes came up with crazier ideas, but like you guys it would be like the horror, blood and gore. And I was like, this is not brand safe, but okay. So we had to take that, be proactive. Again, if you're not part of the solution, you are a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Copyright, again, even if everything is fair use, we're not a-holes, right? Like there are some times when we're like, okay, so we took a lot of those things, and that's what I meant by further professionalizing. And this is not bad. What I swear, I mean, they're not definitely sitting here. The board does not like sit on the live stream, but I myself brought them on because like I would have never considered laying anybody off, right? But when like times got a bit harder and things weren't just automatically going up, they did their job. They were like, have you thought of laying off the staff? And I was like, I had to show them that I was open and I wasn't just rigid, even though most entrepreneurs may be like, yeah, that's good opportunity. Never let a crisis go to waste. I was like, I don't think we have fat. Are there steps? Are there certain people that maybe we don't need? Or if we had to, after 20 years, you have certain added steps and added
redundancies or stuff.
Redundancies, yeah. I almost built for quality.
Yeah.
So I said, I think that would be a mistake. And I explained it to them more like rationally, not emotionally. But I said, I think that like before we know it, there will be a recovery. And as I turned out to be right, again, luck. But I was like, I think YouTube will disproportionately benefit. So I said, we don't want to cut fat, muscle, bone. And I was like, I think what we should do is just trust us, because you're a minority investor. You're not operational. You're not in the trenches. You're not going to care about this. But just let us kind of review everything. And if somebody leaves, whereas in the past we would quickly come and replace them because we didn't want to come and be like, all right, Joe, Dick, Tom, and Harry, you guys got to take all these tasks. Let us kind of like do a self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did it that way. But that was an example of me needing them to at least bring something up that my culture of Tarof and my nature would never think. I would never, even when I was in Buenos Aires, like right before I left, one of our colleagues was like, oh, you invited, let's say 10 of them. There's a couple more. They're not on the, they don't seem to be joining you at the restaurant. I was like, extend the table, bring them on, So, but that's a very different conversation. I needed somebody in the room that could say with no emotion. It wasn't like, oh, Dick that I've worked with for 6 years, or Tommy whose kids I just saw at the company outing. That to me is, that's why I go. I'm not your normal entrepreneur. But they were asking those tough questions, and we did the right things. But again, I wanted that. But now I see if WatchMojo is going to be the best and biggest version of itself, it's not money. It's like a big brother, a big sister, like a bigger company, or a company of our size that's like, you have strengths, we have strengths, because it's true. There's no barriers to entry,
Mm-hmm.
That's basically, a conclusion that I kind of could have seen coming, but I wanted to get it out of my system.
Oh, cool. Kind of an interesting point to wrap things up on. Let's talk about next week's episode. We'll be covering trends and themes in media, successful media franchises.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we obviously will talk about the trends, but I think I want to kind of break down, not to revisit like Joe Rogan, but things like the Acquired podcast, Joe Rogan. There's a lot of, if you really, really look at, okay, what have been the new media brands built? There's an interesting through line. There's some very specific commonalities, and mainly none of them seem to emanate from corporate America. So that's what I think we'll talk about. And the purpose is not just for us to say why Joe Rogan is great or passe or whatever. It's more to help somebody, a young entrepreneurial creative storyteller, listen and go, oh, if I match these patterns and trends to that one thing that I have a comparative advantage in, that I'm passionate about, that I'm willing to do for 3-4 years, I could be the next big thing, basically.
Cool. Should be a good episode. Looking forward to that.
All right.
Gracias, Ash, as always.
Yeah.
Hope you have a great week, and we'll see all of you guys next week for, what is it, episode 16? We're getting
almost
closer
there,
to being...
yeah. And I mean, if in the next 4, as we wrap this up, when we should start to think of, and I don't need to be involved, but just, are there other podcasts and worlds that we could, look out for if the audience has any question? It's just funny as we leave. So when I left the stage, as I said, it was very like first industry data and stuff. And then I turned it a bit more into like motivational, like a coach. And then when I got off the stage manager was like, excellent, you killed it there. And I was like, and I said what I did here. So the outro, just to put into context, that's the background.
Let's finish off with that. We'll see you guys next week, and we'll end with Ash's speech.
That's it. Obrigado. Thank you. God bless Rio. I'm sure they think I'm crazy.